Since folks made such a surprisingly effective job of not spoiling anything from the BBC Netflix Dracula series that came out earlier this year, I just want to go on record as saying that this video is going to spoil the mess out of everything. Earlier this year, Netflix released BBC's adaptation of the classic vampire tale written by Bram Stoker, Dracula, coming courtesy from Stephen Moffat, who you may know from such shows as Sherlock and some of the later seasons of Doctor Who. Now, when I first saw the trailers for this, I have to admit I wasn't particularly interested. It looked very conventional, very much kind of paint by numbers, especially with the casting of Claes Bang as Dracula, and I just thought to myself, this looks like something very basic, something that just looks like it's just going the traditional route, and it didn't seem like anything that I would ever get around to actually watching. Now, admittedly, I have yet to read the actual novel Dracula, although I do plan on doing it at some point, so most of my knowledge of the character comes courtesy of those adaptations in film and television, ranging from Bela Lugosi's turn in the 1930s all the way up to Francis Ford Coppola's masterfully realized version featuring Gary Oldman back in the early 90s. And if I may take this moment to spotlight the 2013 NBC series based on Dracula, which featured John Rhys Meyers playing a reinvention of the character as if inspired by Nikola Tesla. I thought this show was brilliant. I also loved Nonzo and Nosy as Redfield because it was a great reinvention of that character as well, where he wasn't just some sniveling manservant that was just always eating bugs and being creepy. I feel like this was something that a lot of y'all let slip through your fingers, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive y'all. All of this is to say that it's always going to be a challenge to make a character like Dracula fresh and interesting, no matter how many interpretations of the character that we make. But I finally broke down and watched this series last weekend, and I thought that there were some interesting story ideas at play here, especially where they introduce the character of Jonathan Harker from the novel and do things a little bit different with the character, as he's still involved with Dracula in terms of a business venture and ultimately is held captive, drained of blood, and in this case actively turned into one of Dracula's children, and finally escapes only to be found and brought to a convent led by a young nun known as Sister Agatha, and she seems to know a little bit more about Dracula than she lets on, and this starts to build on the mystery of what's going on. Eventually, Dracula does make an appearance, birthing himself from a wolf and just sort of flaunting himself about in his birthday suit and trying to get into the convent where Jonathan Harker is. He knows he can't get in without an invitation, as does Sister Agatha, who decides to taunt Dracula with her own blood. And I have to say that for a nun character, I loved how petty they made Sister Agatha, and I thought it was definitely something that really helped to kind of sell this tension between these two characters, especially once we find out her last name, which happens to be Van Helsing. After his initial confrontation with Sister Agatha, Dracula succeeds in manipulating Jonathan Harker into letting him into the conflict, where a hilariously bloody massacre ensues, and this is where Claes Bang really starts to shine as the character, because this man is chewing on more scenery than necks, in my opinion, and you start to get a sense for the devilish charm that you would expect from a character like Dracula, and I feel like Bang is really pulling it off in these scenes, so I definitely appreciated it, even though initially I felt like there were so many better choices that could have been made for the character of Dracula, but I still have to give the man credit. This definitely comes into play once we get to the whole voyage of the Demeter, which is something that I feel, at least in the adaptations that I've seen of Dracula, usually kind of gets glossed over. I never feel like they're giving it enough attention, so I appreciate that this series decided to kind of flesh things out. We're introduced to a lot of different characters, whether they be passengers or crew members, and kind of giving us a little bit more time to know these people and see Dracula as a fellow passenger and just how he interacts with everybody. And then once people start disappearing on the ship, it starts to turn into a little bit of a murder mystery where the audience already knows what's happening and we're just waiting for the passengers and the crew members to catch up. And you also have this whole mystery of who Dracula has in his cabinet, and even though it should be plainly obvious to the audience, it's still a bit of a surprise to see that he's actually been feeding on Sister Agatha, and there's obviously confrontation that ultimately happens. He's eventually outed, and there's a big scuffle that threatens to sink the entire ship. Dracula gets into one of his coffins and sinks to the bottom of the ocean. Dracula eventually does make it to England after freeing himself from his coffin, and by eventually, I mean 123 years later, as he washes up on the shore in England and is met with a team of mercenaries and a woman who looks very much like Agatha Van Helsing to let him know that he's now in the year 2019. This was something that apparently was a major sticking point for a lot of viewers, especially a lot of my friends who expressed their displeasure in this development, and I submit that my friends may suffer from a lack of vision and imagination. I could be wrong, but I don't care enough to actually let myself be open to that possibility. Maybe I'm just disturbingly easy to please, and I'm more than willing to cop to that, but I felt like this was a pretty novel idea. I kind of liked this whole reveal, and I also, I already kind of love modern interpretations of Dracula more so than ones that take place in the appropriate time setting for the novel. So I was kind of on board for this. I felt like there were a lot of opportunities for really interesting stories that could be told, and I'm also kind of looking at it from a standpoint of how they sort of recontextualize Jonathan Harker, because the woman that Dracula encounters is not Agatha Van Helsing, but a descendant of hers named Zoe Van Helsing, who is a doctor who works for the Jonathan Harker Foundation, which was set up by Mina Harker in his honor after the events of the first episode in the convent. And this is kind of where you just kind of get all of these great little interesting story beats, especially once Dracula decides to be held captive by the Harker Foundation, only to be released with the introduction of Renfield, who informs Dr. Zoe that the law firm that Renfield represents has represented Dracula since the 1800s, and since the Foundation does not want people to know who funds them, it'd probably be a good idea not to let on about their mercenaries and their expansive resources, so they're actually legally forced to release Dracula from captivity. I mean, come on, you've got to kind of love the idea that there are loopholes being exploited by Renfield that allow this foundation to release a centuries-old demon. How can you not love that? As you can imagine, Dr. Zoe is none too pleased about this, especially when measured against all of the experimentations that she had planned to do on Dracula's anatomy. For scientific purposes, of course. Get your minds out of the gutter. Now all she has is a single vial of Dracula's blood, and in a moment of desperation thinks to herself, hey, why should I share this with the entire Foundation? I need to figure out how to stop Dracula, and decides to down the whole vial, which now gives her access to not only Dracula's memories, but also her ancestor, Sister Agatha's memories, so that they together can figure out a way to stop Dracula once and for all. And they better do it fast because Dr. Zoe is dying of cancer. Fast forward 3 months, and Dracula has all but become a child of the modern era, although he hates the fact that he has to exercise now. But he does use dating apps on a regular basis to score meals, while also beginning his vampiric grooming of young party girl Lucy Westenra. I actually kind of like how this plays out, just because there's this great little back and forth texting between Dracula and Lucy, and it's kind of funny because Lucy is actually engaged to marry a rich American, and all of her friends are kind of around her wondering who is this mystery man that she's texting and going off for late night rendezvous with. And it's kind of funny when Dracula, just before he bites Lucy a final time, just to complete the transition into her becoming a full vampire, informs her not to let her family cremate her. She lets her family cremate her. All's well, though, because Lucy is fully conscious in her coffin as the cremation is happening and manages to escape. For the most part. And the series actually does a really good job of building up to her reveal after she comes back as a vampire, because, oh boy, when it is finally revealed, oh my god, this is some great practical makeup effects to just kind of really push how grotesque Lucy looks now, and she was someone who was very much about her looks when she was alive, and she still sees herself in reflections as she was before she was in the cremation chamber. And when you finally see how she looks now, it's just, oh, it's legitimately traumatizing. Like, the burnt flesh, her rib cage is exposed. It's really nasty. And while all of this is happening, Zoe convinces one of the other doctors at the Harker Foundation, Dr. John Seward, who happens to be a friend of Lucy and former slam piece, to help her in her attempt to finally take out Dracula once and for all. And once showing Lucy how she looks now, John is forced with no choice but to put her out of her misery. And yeah, it's a little bit sad. This leads to a final confrontation between Zoe, being puppet mastered by her ancestor Agatha, and Dracula, where Zogatha, as I will call her, decides that in one last-ditch effort, she's going to run across the massive dinner table in Dracula's main hall, because this place is really expansive where Dracula is, you know, putting up his digs, and decides to pull down a curtain to a window that exposes Dracula to one of his most prominent weaknesses, sunlight, as the sun is coming up. And we realize that all of Dracula's weaknesses, everything that's supposed to hurt him, is actually bullshit. And in this moment, Zoe is able to share with Dracula a sobering truth, that he's never been vulnerable to sunlight in the traditional sense, or needed to have an invitation to enter someone's home. He's only sort of convinced himself that these are things that are weaknesses to him because he is ashamed of what he's become. He is ashamed of being this immortal creature that feeds on human blood and can't die. And this is something that he sort of mind-fucked himself into believing, as far as sunlight and the invitation, and you just kind of think to yourself, damn, this is like P. Diddy and Get Him to the Greek level mindfucking, quite honestly. And even the cross is something that he's averse to, or at least made himself believe himself to be averse to, because he sees that what he is a rejection of God, and he thinks to God's only son, who is willing to take one for the team and pay for the sins of man, and it's something that he will never be able to do. Dracula realized sometime in the past that he would never have Jesus's level of swag, and that is a sad realization, don't you think? But Dracula realizes that his ultimate path to salvation may be right in front of him within Zoe's veins, as her blood is cancerous and thereby toxic to him if he were to drink it. So he figures, let's kill two birds with one stone. One, I can spare this woman the slow, painful death of cancer, and I can finally die. And there is some inherent nobility in that, and he's more than happy to take that last drink as both of them succumb to death together. Now, here's the thing. I'm not willing to completely write off this show, because I feel like there are a lot of interesting ideas at play, and I kind of see where the creators were trying to reinvent Dracula for yet again, not even another generation, but the same generation that had had it reinvented for them probably 10, 15 years earlier. But I do kind of see where some people are coming from, as far as they're just being this odd tonal shift and trying to do too much. And I feel like this is one of the situations where they totally should have saved all of the present day stuff for an entirely different series. Like, if you ended this 3-episode series with Dracula waking up in the present day, that would have been a lot more effective. That would have been a great cliffhanger. You could have really drummed up interest in having the audience try to figure out, what are they going to do next now that Dracula's in the present? This is going to be awesome. And you could have really sold that mystery, even though now it looks like they're probably not even going to do a second series. But I could be wrong. Like, especially with British shows, they'll take 2, 3, even 4 years off and then come back with another series as if nothing happened. But I do kind of get the sense that if you're going to do all of the present day stuff after having established Dracula in the past with everything that they did there, you kind of need to give the present day portion a lot of breathing room. You have to give us time to really get to know some of these characters, because I feel like the whole thing with John Seward pining after Lucy and realizing that he's not going to be able to get with her now that she's engaged and furthermore wrapped up with Dracula himself, you kind of need time for that to develop in a slower, organic way and not kind of rush through things, especially when you have the whole other element with Zoe Van Helsing and the Harker Foundation, and trying to kind of wrap that all up in one episode was probably the biggest failing of this show. And obviously, with Stephen Moffat having already worked on a present-day interpretation of Sherlock Holmes with Sherlock, you would have thought that this would have been something where you would have wanted to have as much time as possible to sort of develop all of these new relationships as you're just shifting us from one point in time to another over a century later. And this is where the gender bending of Van Helsing kind of starts to feel less and less innovative and inventive, as I'm sure the makers of the show wanted it to be, because you don't have this time now in the present day to really sort of flesh things out. And obviously, it seems like the only reason that they did the gender bending was to establish this relationship between Dracula and both Van Helsings, where there's this sexual tension that they wanted to have on display, which never feels organic, especially when you get to the present day, because you only have this one episode where you're doing all of these other little subplots and not giving it enough time to develop organically. And it just starts to feel a lot cheaper and not nearly as, flattering to your female actress as you'd like it to be. And it just makes me think to things like, Dracula 2000 and how much better they were able to sort of have that same dynamic with Dracula and the daughter of Abraham Van Helsing, and that worked out so much better in that film than it does here. And that's kind of a shame to have to say, because as much as I enjoy Dracula 2000, I'm also more than willing to admit that it is not an objectively good film. Crapulence. Maybe my friends were right. Hey guys, thanks for watching. As always, if you've got your own thoughts or opinions on the BBC Dracula series, please go ahead and leave a comment in the section below. Don't forget to hit the like button, hit the notification bell, share this video with your friends and family, and if you'd like to keep up to date on more At Random videos, you can go ahead and click the subscribe button right over here.